Well, it's understandable that science went to man's head because, frankly, when you can drive cars and use phones and talk to anybody in the world at any second, you can get a little puffed up thinking that you have power over everything. And people did come to believe that no reality except that ones that conform to the matrices of science, space, time, matter, energy, and number. No realities except those exist. What happened in the modern view of reality is that it levels the worldview that preceded it. Religion is an opiate, if you've studied Marx. Nothing more. It's created by the privilege to keep the poor quiet. It's Nietzsche. Trees are only timber. Deer is only meat. Mountains are only potential quarries. We certainly saw that at the industrial age. For Smith, scientism, which is what we're really discussing, is ontological strip mining, a reduction of life's qualitative aspects to modalities that are basically quantitative. Give up beauty, give up holiness. Why? For a mathematical scheme whose prime advantage is to manipulate matter on the plane of matter, space and time. The big mistake, we'll come back to this in another discussion about Freud, the biggest mistake is the reductionism, attempting to explain the greater in terms of the less. Darwin reduces spirit to metamorphosized matter. Darwin is the struggle for the life is a purely reductionist. I can't think of another word because it's the problem with reductionism. It's the survival of the fittest. Nothing else matters. The fact that people lay down their lives for others, which makes no sense from a Darwin point of view, or you'd have to make a tortured argument, doesn't really matter. Truth is reduced to ideology. Marxists, if you've ever really met someone who's strongly a Marxist, you will know a lot about that. And we come to Freud. Psyche, our entire soul, is reduced to our sexual urges. What Smith wants to do is to re-irradiate the human imagination. He feels that it's atrophied during the Iron Age of this time, and he wants to re-irradiate our imagination with the forgotten truths of the past. We have to reacquaint ourselves with the qualitative levels of reality. We have to explain the lesser by means of the more. This is not an argument for religion so much as an argument for understanding religion. Where does religion fit in? He gives a quotation from Francois, I can't read my own writing here, Petit-Pierre. All primordial men saw the more in the less, in the sense that the landscape was for them a reflection of a superior reality, which contained the physical reality. They added, one may say, to the latter a spiritual dimension, which escapes most modern people. We've looked at this a number of times, but just as a reminder, I'll just put it here. We're going to look at that central dimension of the three-dimensional cross. The gross, the material, the sensible, the corporeal, the phenomenal plane. Freud, when he starts talking about sex, he's talking about the active sex. He's not talking about falling in love or anything to do with that. That's a terrestrial plane. He says, Smith says that there's an intermediate plane. This is where the subtle, the animic, meaning soulful, the psychic, maybe ghosts, or what we are, maybe when we're asleep, where we are when we're asleep. maybe ESP, the psychic counterpart of gravitation's action at a distance. That is what he would call the intermediate plane. He's just picking some examples. There's millions of them. What would be included here would be archetypal images. I haven't taught you anything about that yet. I am going to give you a lecture on Jung. That actually is what I have my graduate degree in, is depth psychology. Jung was Freud's student and broke away from him because Freud was so reductionist. So in the intermediate plane, archetypal images, not the archetypes themselves, that's a different thing, but the images that reoccur in dreams and myths and religions and stories, those symbols that have been occurring throughout all of human history, that is where Smith wants to place them as an intermediate plane. This is a drawing of the mandala we talked about earlier. It's considered by Jung and by pretty much all ancient religions to be the symbol of the self. For Christians, it would correlate to Christ on the cross with both thieves. We'll talk about more of that later. So those archetypal symbols are in the intermediate plane. You can't measure them. They are more likely to happen to you than for you to create them. We know all sorts of archetypal images from studying culture. We know the Great Mother, the Prince, the mandala, symbol of the self. And what Jung says, and Smith agrees, is that these archetypal images exist in this intermediate reality and reflect something that is going on in our personal level, at a personal level. The ego, for example, of an individual, which, by the way, is not a bad thing to have an ego. Having an inflated ego is a bad thing, but an ego itself isn't so bad. You need an ego to do anything. That would be correlated to the mandala, the symbol of the self. Your own mother would be correlated to the archetypal image of the Great Mother. It's not the same as the archetype. And a prince or a movie star in your own life that you, oh my goodness, I remember when the Beatles came to town. Oh, that's how old I am. That would be correlated at the intermediate level of images of the prince archetype. Now, what about a celestial plane? In the intermediate plane, we've shared all these different cultures. They all seem to have these archetypal images. On the terrestrial plane, we all have mothers and fathers and passions for, some actor or actress. The celestial plane, in terms of the levels of reality in that center cross that Smith is creating, is something that he might call world mind, actualization, maybe God actualizes being. This is something to think about. What is a celestial plane? He's not really going to describe it. He's going to leave it there and give it space. Transcendent reality goes beyond what we can see, even in our dreams or in stories or in books. Transcendent reality is something that's going on without our being in control of it. The energy from the God archetype, or self archetype if you like, the male animus archetype, is giving us energy to culture throughout history, and is reflected in the images, let's say, of a prince, and then reflected in our personal lives through our personal experiences of that image, of that energy, sorry. So we've got these planes. We're standing on the ground, terrestrial plane. I've got two little lovers there, young lovers looking at the moon. The intermediate plane, they are experiencing some kind of experience that is reflected in movies, in books, in their culture, TV, and if they do go to church, maybe be reflected there too. And then this celestial plane that's above. We're just going to leave it like that for now. What's the celestial plane like? Well, in the traditional Western mind, the celestial sphere is the sphere of the personal living God who creates the world through deliberate intent. It's easy to see that this could be seen as very anthropomorphic. In other words, it's reducing God to someone like a person. You can't prove it. You can't do a scientific experiment to prove it. You can't disprove it either. When I hear atheists say that they can prove that God doesn't exist because somebody's suffering, I don't understand that, because then what do we do about the people that aren't? There's no way to use science for that. You can't have an hypothesis. Moreover, science actually never proves anything or disproves anything. All it says is the hypothesis has not been disproven. That's the humility that science is supposed to have. Now, I haven't studied as much Eastern philosophy and religion as I have Western, but Smith says that in the Eastern mind, thought flows into man. In other words, you don't have a thought, the thought has you. So becoming of no mind allows man to become with God, become one with God, or one with the Spirit. So you have these qualitative levels of reality. Let's call the level above the celestial plane the infinite. The infinite in Hinduism has no qualities. Interesting, because that's what one of the first things we looked at when we looked at what science cannot measure. In Buddhism, nirvana, non-drawing, that's the infinite. In Taoism, the Tao that cannot be spoken. In Judaism, the Ein Sof of the not finite. And because it's all-inclusive, there's nothing to which it can be likened. Yahweh says, "You cannot know my name." When you're talking about the infinite, you can only use analogies. The Vedantists say Brahman is Sat, Chit, and Ananda, being, awareness, and bliss. And they mean these terms are more accurate than their opposites. The infinite plane is more like a lion that exists than a unicorn that does not exist. You can't get a literal characterization of the infinite. We don't have the ability to do that. Spinoza said, God's knowledge resembles our knowledge to the extent that the dog star resembles a dog. Others say that as soon as you start talking about God, you enter the realm of paradox. If there's anything that's more paradoxical than the Christian story, I don't know what it is. Mystics throughout history have said God is light. Other mystics have said God is darkness, a light of a different order, dazzling darkness. So no image of God is possible. I think it's the first or second commandment, thou shalt not create an image, mainly not to stop you from doing what you want to do, but because it's not possible to do it. You can't have an image of God. What's fascinating, and this is the part where I think you're going to really enjoy Smith the most, is that after studying modern physics, he found that light has been found to simultaneously be a wave and a particle. So electrons that jump orbit without traversing the intervening distance, or a particle that passes through alternate slits simultaneously without dividing. Wow, that is a paradox. We can't imagine it. We can't make a model for it. They can use abstract mathematics, but your imagination cannot take math and, make a picture out of it. If we can't make images of something, then does that mean it doesn't exist? Or does it mean that truth does not need us? And there is no way dependent on our powers of conceptualization. In other words, should we be a little more humble? If we can't conceive it, then is it for all practical purposes irrelevant or not? Well, the belief, in Smith's view, the belief that throughout history it was normal for mankind, that meaning existed in everything that exists, and everything that happens derives a depth from the fact that the ultimate, or infinite as we're calling it, is because the ultimate is omnipresent. It's in all levels of reality, and so also in us.